I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Social media has become an indispensable part of our lives. So it's inevitable that the online culture impacts our personalities and our outlooks. But as platforms such as Twitter and Instagram give us more opportunities to debate and engage with each other, many believe that engagement is now being replaced with hostility and anger, leading to a toxic online culture. Whether that's happening and that is becoming the norm, or this is just a few bad examples, we will be discussing that today. Joining us for this conversation is Kristen, who's a social media consultant and president of Ruby Media Group. She joins us from New York. Also joining us today is Adam Smith, who's a science and technology reporter for The Independent, joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Now let's dive right into it. And let me begin with a very small question, but also one that will really set the premise and foundation for our conversation to follow. Adam, do you feel like people engage differently online than they do in real life?
It's true that people engage online in a different manner than they do in real life. In real life, most of your clout or most of your relationships are determined by the people that are geographically around you. On social media, that reach can be vastly different and vastly greater, and that means that people engage in different behaviors. So, for example, you might want to express your concern about a certain political belief, for example, and you may phrase how you think differently depending on your online audience as opposed to your offline audience. Now, those divides are important and they're not necessarily bad, but as we've seen with other aspects of social media, such as engagement, likes, and other sort of behaviors like that, they can be used to exacerbate things that we really don't want on the platforms.
Right, and I'm gonna, from that last thing you mentioned, they tend to exacerbate things. Kristen, talking about that exacerbating of emotions and the way you engage with people, many individuals, many critics point out towards how online personalities, online personas, as I should say, often tend to be more aggressive. The engagement, the arguments are more hostile in nature than they would be if a person's sitting next to you and you're having a discussion with them. Is that the way you see it as well?
I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think previously we'd call them keyboard warriors, where people would just hide behind their keyboards anonymously. I think what we're seeing recently is that's completely changing. We're seeing more hostility, more aggression of people who are no longer anonymous and are just putting out this content directly from their usernames. I disagree with one of the points made about geography having anything to do with this. I mean, I think people are so angry and so hostile that they will equally be that angry in real life, regardless of geography, right? So you're seeing that play out right now all over the United States with these riots, and you're seeing that transcend to digital platforms. I call it the social media wars, and how individual users are navigating it and how brands are navigating it. It's a very challenging and delicate time right now.
Right. Kristen, you mentioned we're seeing this change, almost like this is a transition from a culture that was more tolerant, was more accepting, and now we're seeing more aggressive and more hostile behaviors from online users. What do you think brought about this change?
Well, I think here, at least, we've had people who are in quarantine for many weeks. Not that that's an excuse, but, I think there's a lot of socio-political unrest at least in the United States. I can't speak about everywhere, but here right now you have a perfect storm of a lot of things happening in the U.S. with justice for George Floyd, it mixed with the pandemic and people locked up and economic uncertainty. You put all of those things together, and again, it's a sort of a massive disaster. And what you're seeing all over the world, right? You're watching that play out in real time on social media platforms. And that is the challenge here. I think we've lost a baseline level of respect for people or businesses. And we're seeing that as people's businesses are being, basically destroyed and lit up in flames here in the United States. We're also seeing that happen online. And there's just a level of tolerance that no longer exists for respect of other professionals, business owners. And so I am seeing other people be very afraid right now of having their businesses basically be trashed online with aggressive behavior. If the rhetoric is something that someone else doesn't agree with, we're hearing about negative Yelp reviews, calling inflammatory remarks to these business owners. So it's a very challenging time to navigate. So some people are staying silent. Others are saying something, but then apparently they're not saying it right. So it's sort of this environment where you just can't win.
Right. Adam, working about, and as Kristen mentioned, talking about the targeting of businesses and other institutions online. But I want to move the discussion and talk about user-to-user engagement. Now, as she said that there are a lot of frustrations, a lot of uncertainties going around right now that are exacerbating those emotions, and maybe that's translating to online. But we've seen that this culture of calling people out, of creating memes out of people that you don't like, all of this has been happening for quite some time now. It might be more visible, more prominent, more amplified now, but it's been happening for quite some time. Do you think that there can be a more, how do you say, a nuanced way of agreeing and talking about things online as opposed to what we're seeing right now?
Yes, I do. I don't think this is an impossible task at all. Research has that, for example, when someone was tweeting racist, inflammatory remarks at someone, a Twitter bot with a white profile picture, or a profile picture of a white person, responding to that tweet saying, "Hey, remember, there's another person on the end of that account," it was shown to reduce the amount of racist posts by that original post to 0 over a couple of weeks. We've also found that more practices that remind people that there are other people at the end of the accounts do help to limit that sort of things. Facebook recently, according to a Wall Street Journal report, had researchers go and try and find ways to make their platforms less polarizing. Now, the question of whether that can be done when platforms profit from greater engagement is one that remains to be seen. But it's certainly the case that extra prompts and talking to people and reminding them of that their behavior online is reflective of them and can have consequences will go a long way. Twitter at the moment is testing a feature where if you tweet something that has what they call hateful language in, they will send you a pop-up that says, hey, something along the lines of, are you sure you want to tweet that, and ask you to reconsider it. Now, that's something that we have in society. You know, if you have a conversation with someone and you say something that they feel is inflammatory, they may come back and say, well, that's a little harsh, and you might consider your argument and maybe posit your thoughts in a different way. It will be interesting to see if we can enact those same kind of behaviors one-to-one in real life on social media, in the digital space, in a way that is tangible and in a way that is also beneficial.
Right. Now, Adam, you're talking about, and the measures that are being taken by these social media platforms also brings me to the question, if this behavior that we see online is in fact engineered by these large corporations, or in fact it just comes down to human behavior. I'd like your take on that, Adam, and then I'm going to move to Kristen and talk to her about it as well.
It depends on your definition of encouraged. I think from the social media companies such as Facebook and Twitter would certainly not say that they encourage inflammatory content on their site and they would take actions to remove it. However, it is also the case that no matter what the content is, Facebook or Twitter benefit from more people posting on their platforms. And we've found over time that the more emotional content is published, the more that gets retweets, the more that gets likes, the more that gets shared. So while Facebook's personal ideology might not be to encourage inflammatory content, as might not be Twitter's, as might not be any social media site, the algorithms and the systems put in place by which these companies profit from it could be argued to encourage it. And that's something we've seen either with YouTube's algorithm on extremist content, on Facebook, and on multiple sites that's been documented over the years. It just depends on how much you want, on how much responsibility you want to give these big companies on how their platform is managed. And I personally feel like they should maybe be taking more responsibility on that.
Right. Kristen, do you agree with that Adam just put there?
I think the responsibility is on the individual user versus the platform. right? So I don't think that Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or any of these platforms is responsible necessarily for the decline in, the way that human beings interact with each other. We can't blame that on big tech. There's certainly a lot we can blame on them right now in terms of issues across the board with censorship or how they're handling certain requests or navigating that. But the way that one human treats another human being, regardless of advancements in artificial intelligence or machine learning or anything else that these companies can do, at the end of the day, that comes down to human evolution or lack thereof in how we're treating one another. And so whether Facebook encourages someone with a pop-up or not to rethink what they're going to say, the fact of the matter is that the person decided that that's what they thought was the best thing to write. And that is going to transcend to how they write emails where there is no pop-up to change that. And that is the challenge that we are faced with right now. Why did it become, when did we lose the art to debating other people in a civil manner? In high school, I did a mock trial on the debate team, and that is what we were taught. We were taught the fundamental skills of debating someone without character attacks and character assassinations. And it was about the legitimacy of a point without making it personal.
Right. Kristen, I just
and that is now gone.
Right. To that thing that you're saying, agree with both parts of what you and Adam have said. The thing that comes to my mind, the example that comes to my mind is when Instagram for a while would hide the like buttons so that would discourage, that was their argument for that it would discourage hate posts, bullying, and to see how users in fact interact with that tool of validation or how many likes you get. And I know at this point this probably sounds like we're so far beyond this question, but why do we have those tools of those retweets and those likes? Do you feel like that just amplifies the problem we're dealing with, where individuals have more extreme opinions in order to gain that validation or attraction online?
I mean, so I think the like button, or at least Instagram trying to do that, isn't as much of the issue. The place I see this be a larger issue on is Facebook right now in the comment thread. And so again, as the other guest said, the more comments that those posts receive, the higher up that is shown in Facebook's algorithm, to the point that if you want to sort of slow that down, you have to temporarily hide the post so that only you can see it and that other people can't see, to try and slow that engagement down. And so it's almost like this wildfire that takes off, that once you start posting, once you start engaging, you could suddenly find yourself embroiled in a heated debate and lose your whole weekend to it, only to realize, was it worth it? And I think that many people are coming to the conclusion that no, it wasn't, because of the toll that this takes on your mental health. There's been numerous studies about increased usage of Facebook leading to depression, and that when people take a break from that, they are happier. And that's been my experience as well.
Right. Thank you so much, Kristen Rube, joining us from New York and talking to us about this. Adam, now, as I was talking about this, and Kristen talks about this, that we do see many researches linking depression and increasing anxiety to social media. And whether it is the platform engineering this or algorithms being responsible for this, we do know at the end of the day, users aren't passive. They are actively engaging in a certain way. Now, let's talk about the idea of echo chambers and the fact that some voices are amplified more and more, and especially those that we agree with. Do you also see that being completely organic, or that being something that social media and the way those platforms work, making us create that dynamic, that social culture online?
I think the notion of echo chambers is an interesting one. And I think obviously people should always try and seek out viewpoints that don't come from their own, let's say, personal belief or personal sphere in order to educate themselves. But on the other hand, I question quite how pertinent that is. Before social media and across sort of human history, people usually only lived in communities of 150. I think that was the size of the average English village. On social media, you have access to a community that could be thousands or maybe millions of people. And it's only now, in the relatively recent stage, that we've truly had to contend with having conversations at that scale. interviews can travel vast amounts of distances and connect with a lot of people, but I can't have every viewer who watches this respond to me right now in the same way that I can on social media. Whether or not that means that these echo chambers are exacerbating it, and I think to some extent they do, and to some extent they don't, is something that we'll have to see over an extended period of time. But I think the idea that it is inherently bad to have a social media platform that is only surrounded by people that like and agree with you is not necessarily one that I agree with. Many people use social media for many different things.
Right.
And it would be strange for me to suggest to someone that, say, uses social media primarily to look at, say, pictures of cute dogs or to keep up with their friends should necessarily have to open their doors to ideas they don't agree with, and ideas that, as I mentioned previously, can be shown to increase depression and increase anxiety. There are many different uses for that, and that's just conversations that we need to have over time. But I don't think we can say definitively one way or the other at this stage.
Right. Adam, now I want to take your opinion on this, and this is something that's a personal observation, that this reaction we see online, and as you say, that people shouldn't have to be put in the position to seek out opinions that go in disagreement with their own. And I feel like a part of that is the reason of what has happened on mainstream media channels, where we have for so long seen false equivalences. We've seen people with extreme opinions being put next to another cause, a cause for justice, and then listening to the other side. On social media, it's almost like a reaction, like you don't need to do that. You don't have to put up that facade of trying to listen to both sides because only one side can be okay. Do you feel like that could be a reaction as to why we see what we see right now?
I certainly feel like that could be an important aspect of it. As you mentioned, we've seen oftentimes, for example, with things like global media, with global warming, with racism and other aspects, the both siding of positions that really do not have that side of the debate. On social media, a like is a like whether you've tweeted something correct or tweeted something incorrect, and whether it's a valuable viewpoint or not. And I suppose the idea that the notion that you should welcome everyone's viewpoint into your own social circle is, as I said before, something that is questionable. I think perhaps if harder stances were taken in the mainstream media against certain aspects, maybe we could see that reflect back on social media. But we've also seen, and research has shown, that social media is very easy to validate your own viewpoints and validate your own morality in comparison to someone else's, and those sort of things is what gets engagement. Whether the changes that you're suggesting, valid as they might be and as probably are, will take time in order to change people's inherent, or let's say cultural behavior. I don't think that's an easy task. I think if this is exacerbating behaviors that we have internally anyway in the digital space, that's going to take a long change before that can be edited.
No, definitely. The point of the conversation is trying to recognize how the culture is evolving, not trying to find one answer to the problem or trying to seek out a solution, but merely trying to bring about and trying to see and observe how we react and act on social media. On that point, I'd also like to introduce Ms. Nilufer Narli, who's a professor of political sociology. She joins us from Istanbul. Thank you so much, Professor Narli, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, as we were talking earlier, on the show, we see a lot of outrage, a lot of anger, and a lot of hostility on social media. And there is this very prominent and evident tone. Do you feel like that is a reflection of how we are evolving as a society offline?
Okay, I have three important points in answering your question. First, with the pandemic, there is a sharp increase in the use of social media. Many people have been using social media, but with digitalization, working online, socializing online, there is an increase. And the second thing, social media connects us, but social media selectively connects us. There is a type of filter bubble. Example, I have a Twitter account, and then I follow some people who have a Twitter account. I follow people who have similar political views with me. maybe I share my political views, but again, my political views are very often similar to those who are following me. So, what happens, we use social media to connect, but unfortunately, there is a very selective connecting. This is a problem because it increases polarization. And then when there is an increase in polarization, intolerance increases. And the third point is that when people use social media, they don't only distribute their own views and opinion. And some people, they share information based on facts, but also people share information not based on facts, fake news. And then some people even, they enjoy creating moral panic. So when we look at social media, we need to consider these 3 points. And I guess you are making reference to the events in the US, and then why people are still angry on the
Professor
street.
Narli, I just interject there because I want to clarify that I don't want to be unfair to this discussion or this debate, especially since what we're seeing unfold on social media at this point in time regarding to the Black Lives Matter movement. I think a part of the anger and a part of the tone that we see is because social media has become an integral role, has become an integral tool in bringing about justice. I mean, what we saw unfold was precisely because a video was recorded and it was put on social media. Do you think that this anger is also because the lack of institutional justice we're seeing across the world?
Of course, when we look at the situation in the U.S. context, history plays a role. The history of slavery and separation of blacks, a type of apartheid system, they created deep traumas. And today what's happening, Black people are still the target of the police violence. There is a statistic, and the statistic shows that despite there is a decrease in the number of the people who are becoming, white people and Hispanic who are becoming target of police violence, there is an increase in the number of Black people becoming the target of police violence. This is the statistic from 2017-2019. It was reported by Euronews. Okay, now I like to point out the positive aspect of social media. Okay, social media is also used to circulate political information, to communicate political information, to get organized. So people create civil society organizations. So there's a political mobilization, political organization, and looking for justice by using the digital media tools. In fact, digital media is important part of digital democratization. Very often I mention digital democratization. Some people in these days are very afraid of digital dictatorship, and then nation states are becoming more authoritarian, so they are the fears and worries of people. But I tell people that there is also a counter force. This is the organization, political organization, dissemination of political information, and then creating a call for justice by using the social media.
Right. Ms. Nilufer, on that point, thank you so much, Ms. Nilufer Narli, for joining us from Istanbul, and Adam Smith for joining us from London. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back as we continue our discussion on how the online culture is impacting us in the ways we debate and engage with others. Now joining us for this conversation is Shmyla Khan, who's the Program and Research Manager at Digital Rights Foundation. She's also a lawyer by training. She joins us from Lahore. Also joining us is Professor Cary Cooper, who's a Professor of Psychology and Health at the University of Manchester. He joins us from Manchester. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Cary Cooper, I'd like to begin with you and talk about the idea of validation. How important and how powerful is this human need if you do see it as a human need?
In terms of social media, people being on Facebook, getting more friends, or being on Twitter and getting more followers, I think for a certain generation that becomes quite important, particularly the pre-millennials and the millennials. I think it's less important probably for older people, although they use it in a different sort of way, or they look at social media and they use it in a much more pragmatic, practical way. But it is a very kind of addictive platform, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or any of them. And I think that's becoming the kind of issue. And it's also quite a powerful medium because it's used by marketeers in business. It's used by political advocates, people who are promoting politicians and political ideas. So it's quite a powerful tool in our day and age.
Right. Professor Cary Cooper, if we take out social media from conversation for just a couple of minutes and discuss that idea of validation, we often see it in a negative light. Do you agree that it is always negative trying to seek out that validation for your opinions or your own self?
In some ways, it could be positive in the sense it gives some people who don't have a voice, it gives them a voice. It gives them, they can express their political views, and they then think it may have an impact. Because here's the issue. In politics and in life generally, there are quite a lot of people who don't feel they have control over things that are going on. They don't have control in the United States over Trump's tweets or the policy of a government or whatever it is. And what they do is they can therefore express their views. And they then would feel the more followers they get, the more people validate them in one form or another by following them, then they feel that their expression, their views, their voice is actually being heard. So that, I guess, is a potentially positive. I think the difficulty arises when their views are extreme, and when they actually misjudge, and where they don't feel they have constraints on their freedom of speech, right, and say things that damage other people, for example.
Right. Shmyla, when carrying on from this conversation about validation and the fact that individuals are becoming more active on social media, how important do you think it is in this day and age to have an active social media profile?
I think it's immensely important, and especially in the context now that we've seen with COVID-19, a lot of students, for example, are now talking about the importance of internet connections and the disparities that we have in Pakistan. So not having either access to the internet or not having a presence on, for example, a professional platform or through email or then even social media leaves you behind, because your access to information, your access to a lot of opportunities is also impacted by that. So, and I think we understand the importance of it sometimes because of the denial of that access sometimes as well. So I think now this new generation is consuming so much information from social media, and almost every major publisher is present on social media. Even social media companies themselves have become publishers, according to a lot of people and the way that they see. So I think you would be left behind to quite an extent if you're not on social media, unless it's obviously a personal choice where you're sort of prioritizing your privacy, but that's also a choice.
Right. Professor Cary Cooper, you mentioned earlier the issue with fake news. Shmyla also talks about how living in COVID times has given us a new perspective as to how social media needs to be used and how it is being used. Now, COVID-19 presents us an excellent example of how people engage with information they agree with and the type that they disagree with. What do you think creates this resistance to let go of opinions you hold, whether they are related to fake information, fake news that you really believe is true, even if you have facts sitting right in front of you?
I think that's a danger, that people do see it as more factual than it actually is. And that, I think, is a danger. Incidentally, given the analytics that are done on people's use of social platforms, then actually what ends up happening is you don't actually get many. The analytics take you to people who agree with what you actually believe in. So in a funny sort of way, it doesn't give you a different view of the world, quite the opposite. It gives you a view that reinforces your own view. In other words, the analytics identifies the people that you should be talking to who hold the same either political or other views. And that is a quite interesting dynamic. It would be better, I think, if the analytics didn't do that, if you were exposed more to what other people had to say, because then whatever fake news is used, you could kind of balance it and look at it more objectively.
Right. Professor Cooper, we had this conversation here in the show, whether it's analytics that causes the creation of these echo chambers that we see, or if it's human choice. But I want your opinion on this as a professor of psychology. Do humans, is it innate human behavior to seek out opinions which align with your own? Or as humans, are we allowed, or are we programmed that way to seek out information that we disagree with? I mean, what is the human behavior aspect of how we share information and how we try to find information online?
It depends on what your view is on a particular topic. So if you have very strong political or religious or other views, then the probabilities are you would want to seek people who held those same views as you on that particular topic. If your views were less extreme and you were really on the margins one way or another on a particular topic, then you would probably be more open to seeking different views from your own. Psychologically, people themselves want to be consistent as much as they can, and so they will do things that reinforce kind of their own views. But it has to. But particularly if you feel strongly about something, but if you don't, you may want contrary information so you can actually make up your own mind.
Right. That's right. On that point, I'd also like to introduce Ms. Rozan Ahmed, who's an advocate and activist. She talks about social change, exchange, and youth development and mental well-being. She joins us from Dubai. Thank you so much, Rozan, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, as we're talking about engagement online, I want to put this to you. What do you think, what really means to meaningfully engage with other people? What does meaningful engagement mean?
Meaningful engagement for me essentially means education, enlightenment, shifting of perhaps some kind of fixated perception, unlearning in order to relearn. That for me is meaningful exchange. And that is how we can best use these online platforms rather than depend on them as well. Again, meaningful exchange isn't just sharing, isn't just educating, it's also doing. So understanding that these social media platforms are useful as a tool towards an eventual do, towards action, towards build. We shouldn't be dependent on quote unquote meaningful exchange. We shouldn't be entirely dependent on that. We should be understanding that social media is a tool leading towards a better do.
Right. Do you see that happening, as you mentioned that word unlearning, see that happening as a trend on social media, or do you feel like the way online culture is evolving is in fact opposed to that process of unlearning information?
Yes, to a degree. I do see meaningful exchange. I do see learning, unlearning, relearning. I see it in certain spaces, but unfortunately, what dominates the online space is misinformation, is dependency, like a heavy dependency. There seems to be this overarching idea that saying something is enough or presence is enough. I mean, if we look at, for example, the monster that is the Black Plight right now in the United States, and what is translating online, you see a lot of talk, a lot of almost performative activism, where saying something is enough, or there's this demand, we must say something, we must this, we must that. But then what is behind the say? You know, what are the actions taken behind what you are saying, what you're posting? What are you actually doing? So I feel that what we should do, along with saying, is ask necessary questions behind what it is you're saying. You know, as much as it is wonderful to exchange, lend voice, start conversations. And what are conversations? They should be steps towards development. It should be a fundamental step towards development. So that is what I'd like to see more of.
Right, Rozan,
I'd like to see more questions.
Right, Rozan, that's such an excellent there about how we need to move beyond this performative activism and actually engage, even if that means engaging within the space of social media, which means to actively talk about things which matter and try to get people more on board in the fight, in movements which matter. Shmyla, do you agree with that there is an increased space and also an increased number of people who are just involved in performative activism, as Rozan says?
I think I have mixed feelings about this. Firstly, in the sense I completely agree, because a lot of what we see online doesn't translate into sort of structural change, for example. So the problem of race or the problem of even economic plight are issues that are grounded in larger structures, and a lot of times online activism can result in sort of more individualized struggles, or people building sort of individual identities, or maybe focusing on particular cases that are that don't really lead to structural change. But at the same time, I think people are evolving in the way that online spaces are evolving. People are having these conversations, ironically, also online. So people will call others out. For example, like you see celebrities now being called out for just having one tweet up about Black Lives Matter. People will ask them to donate as well. So, or to do something more substantive. So I think people are evolving and they're trying to understand, and online spaces are, especially I think during these times, like where collectivization has completely come to a halt. So traditionally, how we saw organizing happening on the streets or maybe in public spaces, that has completely come to a halt, and we see people using online spaces to have those conversations, to connect with one another, to understand the world and make sense of it as well. So I wouldn't say that all of it is performative, and also sometimes just I think people are becoming very wary of this kind of activism as well, and those conversations are, people are quite self-aware, I think.
Right. Rozan, now Shmyla talked about the culture, and that often leads to the cancel culture. I want to get your take on this. Do you think that the cancel culture is in fact in opposition to what we call meaningful engagement and debate, because it just puts a halt to that process?
That's another good question. Cancel culture is such an interesting dynamic, because on the one hand, of course, it's useful and it's important that we call out injustice, that we call out on individuals that, you know, are painting a very different picture through what they say as opposed to what they do. Going back to my original point. So yes, cancel culture does have its validity and does have its power, and it is necessary to enlighten and hopefully evolve us as humanity. But at the same time, to stop on call out cancel culture, to just stop there, to call somebody out, to humiliate them online, to expose them online and just stop there, that's where, for me, it becomes problematic, because then it turns into almost, you know, who do we attack today? And then we move on. And we find another person, and then we move on. And then, you know, in terms of healing, in terms of moving forward, in terms of, you know, what has this person learned from his or her canceling? have they improved? Have they shifted? You know, there never seems to be adequate follow-up when it comes to cancel culture. Like, where's the follow-up? and that for me is problematic.
Right, and it's a really important point, Rozan, that you put up there, that complexity you mentioned there, that we just end the conversation there. One last question to Professor Cooper. Professor Cooper, now, when should a person identify when social media is causing them anxiety and stress, and that's signaling them to get off of it?
I mean, that is true, and that happens a lot with teenagers who go on Facebook or Twitter and get rejected somehow, and that can be very damaging. It depends on your level of self-esteem, but you're absolutely right. It is a high-risk strategy for people who who have low self-esteem, need validation, need to feel they're important, need to feel other people love them, and they, in various ways, either get rejected or bullied or whatever. And yes, there are blocking mechanisms on all the social platforms, but nevertheless, it can really be quite damaging psychologically to people who may be more vulnerable in terms of their own.
It's a very interesting conversation, but unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, Ms. Shmyla Khan, for joining us, Professor Cary Cooper, and Ms. Rozan Ahmed for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.